So there were about 100 protesters outside of the synagogue in West Orange, New Jersey. They were Palestinian and Jewish activists, and they were there to protest what was going on inside the synagogue, which was there was a real estate company that was selling off or trying to land that had been illegally confiscated, or the plan was, from Palestinians, land in the West Bank, some land even in Gaza. And there was a young man named Riley who had managed to get into the synagogue. He had to provide the name of his synagogue and his rabbi, and they had looked at him before, his social media post, and he was in there not just to say, Palestine is not for sale, right? He had not come that day to renounce his Jewish faith or to resign from his synagogue. He had come there to call his people and his faith to be their best, right? To stand and say, how we treat the stranger in our midst is everything. And working for a world of justice is everything. And working for a world of peace is the center of who we are. And that's the same spirit in which Jesus showed up in the synagogue here. He shows up, sometimes we think, oh, Jesus came to start Christianity. Jesus was a reformer like many other rabbis of the day, many other teachers of the day. He didn't show up to start something separate. He showed up in the temple and the synagogue to call his people to be their best, to live out the tradition of the prophet Isaiah. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, called me to preach good news to the poor, sight to the blind, release to the captives, and to proclaim the acceptable day of the Lord. That acceptable day or year was what we think of as a Jubilee year. Many of you have heard of that. It's kind of written about in the book of Genesis. You know, you think about a Sabbath is the seventh day. God created the world in 6 days. Seventh day you rest. Then a sabbatical year is the seventh year of a seventh year where you can rest and the land is allowed to lie fallow. And then a Jubilee would have been the sabbatical of the sabbatical, the 49th year when debts are released and land is restored to whoever originally had it, which would have been a radical redistribution and a very big economic upheaval, right? If all of a sudden, we kind of just like redistributed what there was in this country. So scholars think this probably never happened because there's not any archaeological evidence, and that would have been a really huge thing, but it's still held out there as an ideal. And then Jesus says, this is kind of after he quotes Isaiah, there would have been the expectation that he would have done a teaching or preached a sermon, kind of the expectation in the synagogue, and he preaches a very short sermon. He just says, today, these scriptures have been fulfilled in your hearing. And then he sits down. Today. That is such an important word, right? Today. Because again, people at the top count on the inactivity of other people and the resignation to just do whatever. But today is a reminder that we have to get going. And I've talked about this, many of you have heard me say this before, that a woman totally changed my life and my ministry and the direction of it in about 1990, and that was Donna Blackwood. I met her when I first moved here. She died 5 years ago. She was 20 years older than me. She was an artist from an artist family. Her husband was one of the people who worked, on all the subsidiaries of Hallmark back in the day when that was a huge thing. She was beautiful. They had a beautiful home. She had beautiful daughters. She was this beautiful spirit. Nobody had an eye for joy like Donna Blackwood. And an eye for justice. I remember looking out of my office at Community Christian Church and seeing her down there, all the signs about to stop the Iraq War. She had the prettiest signs too, right? And when I started St. Andrew, I remember going by her house to just talk to her. I'd been at a conference with 10 other new church pastors, and here were all these bulletins and examples and flyers. And I remember her just taking them and kind of like setting them aside. And she was like, let's get some pictures of kids and put them on a brochure. And I was like, well, we got one family with kids, and that's the good ones. I'll talk and see if maybe we can do that next week. And she's like, school's out. Let's go get them right now. It was like that was every single thing with Dawn. It was today. It's like right now, let's go get it. Let's do it. Totally changed my life. Made me be a much more proactive person. And you could say, well, you moved too fast, but you know what? There were 10 new church pastors in my cohort and 2 of us made it, right? I mean, you have to move forward. You have to work. You have to try. You have to give it. You have to just, anything worth doing turns out is worth doing. It's nice to do it well, but sometimes it's nice to just do it, right? And get out there and learn and grow. And I've been thinking about today since we had our session last week with Lauren and Sarah. Many of you were here. We talked about finding steady ground. We made these little cards. I think they're in the back of Paula's car at the airport. But anyhow, we had some of them last week, but many of you were here. We had a nice crowd stay. And one of the things they talked about was just every day what you would do. And every day, one of them is decide how much news you will get, where you will get the news from, and what you'll do afterwards. And then the next one was like every day have human connection and make sure you're continuing that. My life is a lot of human connection, so I don't have to worry about that part too much. But the news, most of my life, I have been a person who has massively consumed public radio until about the last year and a half. And then I'm like, yeah, I don't listen to much news. So doing this, but I care and I want to know. So I made a plan. I decided, get up, listen about 15 minutes of NPR while I make my hot tea. And then what I'm going to do afterwards, and I've done it every day this week, light a candle, light my little lamp that I got in the West Bank from the little Palestinian village, and then eat an orange. I heard someone preach this sermon, I bet it's been 25 years ago, and it was the most evocative, beautiful sermon. The person like peeled the orange. I can't do it the way they did it, but they peeled the orange, and the spray just went everywhere. And the smell, the way an orange smells, and there's something about it like, how did all that get inside this, right? I mean, I just don't understand. So I decided, and it's also a symbol of Palestinian people, but I just decided, and I've done it every single day this week, to kind of ground myself, to light that candle, to light the lamp, to eat that orange, to be reminded, and then to read a little bit, too, of kind of these hopeful meditations from, of all places, Gaza. I'm interested in what you all are doing and what your practices are, of how you're grounding yourself in this moment while we keep reaching out and doing the work we already do and think about how are we going to move forward in this difficult moment today. And then the next part of the passage that always jumps out at me is not just what Jesus says. Sometimes it's what's left out. And, you know, our lives are not steeped in Scripture like the first century people's lives were. And Jesus is quoting the prophet Isaiah, Spirit of the Lord is upon me, preach good news to the poor, recover your sight to the blind, let the oppressed go free, proclaim the acceptable day of the Lord, and the day of God's vengeance. But Jesus leaves that part out. Everybody would have expected it because everybody expected vengeance, right? An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, someone hurts you, you hurt them back. But Jesus left that out. People would have noticed, right? I mean, and it was like Jesus is saying, hello, that's not getting us anywhere, right? So instead, the kind of teaching that we'll hear again in another chapter or two about someone hits you on the cheek, turn the other cheek. Someone needs your coat, give them another coat. I mean, it's like we are never going to get anywhere if it's my response to you hitting me as I hit you hard back, right? So it's got to be a different, fresh way beyond vengeance, beyond hatred, towards something fresh. If there are a people on the planet alive right now who have a reason to feel revenge and vengeance, it is surely the Palestinians. I don't know how many ways you slice it, anyone can ever really come up with the idea that they should have suffered for what the Germans did to the Jews, right? I mean, you can go back to the 1800s and read Theodore Herzl, read the Balfour Declaration in 1917. You can kind of wind the whole thing out. But really, like somehow when the state of Israel was created, more than half of the Palestinians lost everything they had. And yet, they are the warmest, kindest, most hospitable people you'll ever meet. Before I went to the West Bank twice, people told me that. I've been privileged to travel in Central America and Southern Africa and Europe, and Turkey people, and people in the Middle East tend to be extremely warm and hospitable. And they have this thing about them that once they open their door to you, the village is required to take you in. So there's just this incredible giving and generosity. The Palestinians, of course, are automatically equated with what? Hamas. That would be like equating every American with what? The January 6th rioters. Hamas was elected, let's go back. What year was that? That was 2006. The last time there was an election, and then there was a massive blockade, and what's the median age in Gaza? The median age in the United States is 38. Median age in Gaza is 18. This tells you a lot of the people, I mean, they were barely elected. They didn't get half the vote. They were barely lost to Fatah. I mean, barely beat Fatah out. They weren't popular before October 7th. They're not, but only the Palestinians are somehow people Middle East, Lebanon, Hezbollah. I mean, they just can't, hello, who here wants to be equated with the KKK, right? I mean, there are fringe violent elements in every single society. So, a year ago, some writers, a couple of Palestinians and a couple of Middle Eastern correspondents decided the Palestinian voice in Gaza right now has to be heard. So they came together to write a book called Daybreak in Gaza. And I remember at the first when I heard of it and heard Jewish Currents and other people doing podcasts, I was like, yeah, I cannot listen to something called Voices in Gaza right now. I just cannot. This is the most hopeful, heartening compilation. It is just so incredible. And the other Palestinians outside of Gaza, I don't think I realized this, the way they kind of hold people in Gaza with a sense of awe and admiration because of almost their freedom and liberty. Like, it's a weird thing, but in the West Bank, there's so many checkpoints. You can't get from here to there. A 15-minute walk takes you 5 hours. But in Gaza, while it is sort of an open-air prison and no one can come in or go out for 20 years, once you're in there, people have been, until the war, able to move freely. And what you find is this joie de vivre. You find these people who live such a big way, donkey carts pulling oranges and strawberries and people fishing and children playing. Remember how we talked a couple of years ago now about the children, how they flew their kites, set the Guinness Book World Record. All the little kids from Gaza flew the most kites, bounced the most soccer balls, made the little hand display. I mean, just this incredible liveliness. So these authors wanted to capture this story, very difficult and dangerous to do. They found shopkeepers and artists and students and others who wanted to tell their story. They would text them, but of course there's no internet signal, so difficult. People would, to tell their story, leave their house at midnight and try to find an internet signal with the worst, most dangerous time to get their stories out. And what emerges is this story that is just so hopeful and humorous and full of humanity. The falafel shop owner who wants to rebuild, whose shop has been destroyed 3 times, still at it. Humorous stories about Lulu the cat, how they smuggled the cat to the wedding in Jerusalem or wherever. And then, of course, the Free Gaza Circus. So many of you have seen these images. You think, can this really be real? People who themselves are traumatized and grieving and somehow find a way to travel from little area to area, entertaining kids. And then, more stories. A guy named Joseph, his family, he's an Orthodox Christian priest. There's so few Christians left there. His family lives on land that they've been on since 5th century. I mean, just these incredible stories. And then Amani Shaltut, she was born in a refugee camp 50 years ago, and for the last 25 years she's been the UNRWA archivist who documents videos and photos and has digitized so much, still working every single day through all of this. And when you ask her what her favorite images of, their education, their children in refugee camps on beaches, studying in the open air from the 1950s and 60s, such a sense of pride and hope, because in Gaza, the literacy rate is 97%, one of the highest literacy rates in the world, and the highest degree of people with graduate degrees anywhere in the Arab world. These people who have been abandoned by Europe, the United States, all of the Arab states, and their heart is still, there has to be a way forward, right? Today, what does it mean for me in my own smallness to still be harboring some stupid feelings about someone who hurt me or I think took something from me? Really? Let that go, to embrace the Jubilee, to embrace a different kind of world. So each day we wake up, we light our candle, we eat our orange, we think about people who, not to be like, we don't know anything about it, but people whose faith and courage reminds us of what's yet possible. All those people in this country too, who endured so much to bring us to this day, and sisters and brothers around the world too. So this day, may we be reminded of the grace and generosity and faith all around us. May we find our own small way to help move this world along, confident that God's love, God's hope, God's compassion will continue to carry us. Amen.